Hello students, today I'll be recording my lecture on chapter 17, which is government budgets and fiscal policy. Now, what I'd like to do, of course, is quickly recap a certain key diagram that we've been using, and that is the diagram of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Right, so let me quickly replicate that. You've seen that in my previous lectures. So this is essentially treating the entire economy as if it were a single market, right? So on our horizontal axis, we measure the quantity of all final goods and services as measured by real GDP, represented by the letter Y. On the vertical axis, we measure the price level, which is our measure of all prices. And essentially, this is nothing other than the value of the GDP deflator or the GDP price index. And remember, we scale this down by 100. So think of that as the price level, right? So it's the GDP price index or GDP deflator divided by 100. Let's throw in the aggregate demand curve, negatively sloped like that. And then we have the short-run aggregate supply curve, which is positively sloped like this. Recall in chapter 14, we learned that the long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line, correct? So this is the short-run aggregate supply curve, SR for short run, AS for aggregate supply, and this is the aggregate demand curve. We have macroeconomic equilibrium where the two curves intersect right there, and that brings us to the equilibrium level of GDP in the economy and also the equilibrium price level, P star. Right, now how do we depict a recession in this diagram? A recession would be as follows. Full employment real GDP Y sub F is to the right of equilibrium GDP Y star. This gap here is called a recessionary gap, correct? I'm saying nothing new here. I'm just recapping stuff that we learned in previous chapters. So currently we can say that in this economy with equilibrium level of GDP Y star, employment must be less than full employment, right? How is that? Because you see, you have full employment when the level of GDP produced is Y sub F, right? A smaller amount of GDP Y star would need less workers to produce it. So employment would be lower, right? So employment would be lower at this level of GDP than at Y star level of GDP. Employment lower than at full employment, right? And this, of course, implies that unemployment is higher than at full employment. Now, what is the unemployment rate at full employment? It's natural unemployment, or the unemployment rate would be the natural rate of unemployment, which is believed to be about 4% for the United States. So currently at GDP level Y star, the unemployment rate exceeds 4%. Right? So this is an economy in recession, correct? So according to the Keynesians, now the Keynesians put a lot of faith on fiscal policy, right? Now what again is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is the policy of the government. So fiscal policy is the policy of the government, and I say government, I mean the president plus Congress. right? And its policy about government spending, G, and taxes, T, right? So in this kind of a story here, when there is a recession, we've learned that, according to the Keynesians at least, the economy will not fix itself. This recession might linger on for quite a while. Now, eventually, according to the neoclassical economists, the high unemployment would cause wages to fall, and that might cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right, thereby narrowing that recessionary gap. Correct? But the Keynesians believe that this might take quite a while to happen. So they think that the government and the Fed have to be proactive, have to take steps to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. How to use fiscal policy to do this? Well, you must remember that aggregate demand is made up of C, I, G, and X minus M. Consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. So you can see right here that government spending is a part of aggregate demand. So if the government raised its own spending, this would certainly raise aggregate demand. But we've learned that the effect will actually be a multiplied effect. How is that? Because we've learned that when G goes up, this causes consumption spending to go up also. How is that? Let's say the government increases its spending on highway construction. The money it spends will end up in the paychecks of the construction workers, who in turn will go and spend a large fraction of that increase in their paycheck on consumption in their local communities. Correct? So we have the expenditure multiplier at work then. Right? So this is all stuff we've learned before. Right? So in this chapter, we look at the workings of fiscal policy in some more detail. We'll introduce a few more vocabulary terms, etc. So without further ado, let me launch into the meat of the chapter. Right, so first, let me mention the following terms: budget deficit. Now, what is a budget deficit? When does a government run a budget deficit? Now, the government's budget, of course, consists of its spending and its so-called income from tax revenues, T. So anyone's budget consists of money coming in, money going out, right? Money being spent, money being earned. Now, in the case of the government, what it spends is government spending, and what it receives is its so-called earnings or income is tax revenues, right? So the budget deficit is defined essentially as G, government spending, minus tax revenues. So that's the definition of the budget deficit. So if this were positive, this would be when G is bigger than T. If the government is spending more than it collects in taxes, that is when it is said to be running a budget deficit, because the budget deficit is positive, is a positive number. The government is spending more than it's collecting in taxes, right? So the government runs a budget deficit when it spends more than it collects in taxes. How is this sustainable? How can anyone spend more than their revenues and their income? How would you pull it off personally? How would you spend more than you earn? Well, the only way that you can finance this, the only way that you can pull this off is by using your credit card. Is that correct? By borrowing. So this G being greater than T, or government spending being greater than taxes, this deficit has to be financed by government borrowing. So when the government runs a budget deficit, it has to borrow. And what does government borrowing do? It causes the national debt. And the national debt is basically all the money the government currently owes, the government's current indebtedness. So if you use your credit card today, for instance, wouldn't that cause the balance on your credit card to go up? In other words, the sum total you borrow to go up. Now, the sum total the government owes its creditors is called the national debt. So when the government borrows, the national debt goes up, right? how can fiscal policy be used? How can fiscal policy be used to fight a recession and unemployment, the unemployment that comes from a recession, the cyclical unemployment that you see in recessions, right? And here again, I'm going to quickly replicate our ADAS model, the same diagram that you saw in my previous page. So let me draw a diagram for a recession. And you know what this looks like already. Real GDP, price level, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply. This is where we have macroeconomic equilibrium, real GDP, which is less than full employment real GDP, and that is your recessionary gap. So how can we use fiscal policy to combat this recession, to bring the economy back to full employment? Because currently the unemployment rate is greater than 4%. In other words, in addition to the frictionally and structurally unemployed, meaning the naturally unemployed, we also have some structurally unemployed, some cyclically unemployed workers, right? Some cyclically unemployed workers. So we have high unemployment, and how do we bring the unemployment rate back down to the natural rate of 4%? Well, according to the Keynesians, this would have to be done by shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right, correct? So this would have to be done as follows. Working backwards here, the aggregate demand curve needs to be moved all the way to the right, like this, correct? So if the aggregate demand curve was shifted all the way to AD prime, we would have a new equilibrium right there, and equilibrium GDP would equal full employment GDP. There would no longer be a recessionary gap, right? So this is how one can use fiscal policy to fight a recession. This would involve doing what to government spending? Well, government spending would need to go up, correct? Because, as I said, government spending is a part of AD. So when government spending goes up, AD automatically increases, the AD curve shifts to the right. But we've learned that this is also going to be a multiplied effect. The expenditure multiplier is going to kick in. The increase in government spending is also going to cause an increase in consumption spending, right? So the rise in G causes aggregate demand to increase by many times the increase in government spending, right? So we have the expenditure multiplier at work here, right? What about taxes? What would have to be done to taxes to increase aggregate demand? Well, the government would, of course, have to cut taxes both on households and businesses. How is that? When taxes are cut on households, that would leave households with more of their income with which to go shopping. Household disposable income would increase, right? So you have household disposable income increasing, and what is that going to do? That's going to cause consumption spending to go up, right? Now, what about reduced taxes on businesses? Well, if taxes are lowered on businesses, this would leave businesses with more of their revenues with which to go shopping for new machinery. So that's going to cause investment spending to go up, right? So this combination of G going up and T going down, well, this combination has a name. It's called expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy. Fiscal policy designed to expand aggregate demand, shift the AD curve to the right, thereby narrowing a recessionary gap. So this is how fiscal policy can be used to fight a recession. Now, what about inflation? What about inflation? Now remember that low inflation is another macroeconomic goal, correct? So fiscal policy to fight inflation. So once again, let me draw our ADAS diagram. Real GDP, the price level, aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply. So in this diagram, we have macroeconomic equilibrium right there. This is going to give us equilibrium GDP Y star and the equilibrium price level P star. So what is inflation? Inflation would be an increase in P star, right? And this might be caused by rightward shifts of the aggregate demand curve. So if the aggregate demand curve were rapidly shifting to the right, let's say that consumption spending greatly increases, or businesses start to buy a lot more new machinery, this kind of rightward shift in the AD curve is going to cause the equilibrium price level to go up. So we would have inflation, and this kind of inflation has a name. It's called demand pull inflation. So if we have inflation of this kind, inflation caused by too rapid an increase in aggregate demand, then the way to fight this inflation is by the government doing the opposite of what it did to fight unemployment, to fight a recession. So in this case, what the government would want to do is put the brakes on this too rapid a rightward shift of the AD curve. And the way to do this is to decrease its own spending and raise taxes. Decreasing its own spending would, of course, prevent the AD curve from shifting further to the right, or even bring the AD curve back leftwards. Right? And there would be this expenditure multiplier at work as well. Correct? And if the government raises taxes, well, this would leave households with less disposable income with which to go shopping. And higher taxes on businesses would leave businesses with less of their revenues with which to go shopping for machinery. Right? So this kind of policy then is called contractionary fiscal policy. Not expansionary, but contractionary, designed to contract or decrease. Decrease what? Aggregate demand. So this is where fiscal policy might be used to fight inflation. But of course, remember that there is another kind of inflation called cost push inflation. Right, so let me draw the diagram for cost push inflation. And here we would have something like this. The AD curve, the short-run AS curve. Right? Quickly label the axes here. Short-run aggregate supply, the price level. And now let's say that a hike in oil prices, energy prices, causes the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. Now, wouldn't this also cause the equilibrium price level to go up? So here we have inflation again, but this is inflation caused not by a rapidly increasing aggregate demand, but rather by a decreasing aggregate supply. So this kind of inflation is called cost push inflation. And this kind of inflation really can't be combated with contractionary fiscal policy. How is that? Because if the government pursued contractionary fiscal policy, meaning decreased government spending and raised taxes, what would happen is that the AD curve would shift to the left, and that might combat the inflation, but the result would be a widening recessionary gap. Is that correct? Because you would have a new equilibrium, let's say here, correct? And we would have a decrease in equilibrium GDP. So yes, cost push inflation might be fought with contractionary fiscal policy, but the result would be higher unemployment, right? So if we have the phenomenon of stagflation is a phenomenon that was observed in the US in the 1970s. The aggregate supply curve shifting to the left, which causes inflation as well as a widening recessionary gap. So we have a stagnating economy and we have inflation. Now, if we combat this with contractionary fiscal policy, this would simply worsen the stagnation, worsen the recession. Correct? All right. Pardon me. Right. Next, I'm going to once again revisit fiscal policy. Right, so we've learned what fiscal policy is, correct? It's policy about government spending and taxes, and it's controlled by the government. And by the government, I mean the President and Congress. Right? Now, fiscal policy has two parts, or rather, there are two components to fiscal policy. One of them is called automatic fiscal policy, and the other one is called discretionary fiscal policy, automatic and discretionary. So let me talk about these two terms. Right? Now we know that when there is a recession, what kind of fiscal policy do we need? We need expansionary fiscal policy, policy designed to expand aggregate demand. So this would involve government spending going up and taxes going down, correct? Now what automatic fiscal policy says is that some of this happens automatically without the government having to take any deliberate action. How is that? Well, first, when there is a recession and real GDP decreases, and GDP, of course, is the same thing as aggregate income, correct? Remember the old idea from the circular flow of income that GDP was also income, right? So with lower income, in other words, many people are now poor, many more will qualify for government assistance. You see, consider welfare, government welfare payments. You can only receive these if you are poor. So the point here is that in a recession, more people become poor, become eligible for government assistance, right? And so this means automatically the government spending on so-called income security programs, right? Government spending on income security programs designed to provide individuals with income security. Spending on income security programs automatically goes up. Now this is happening completely automatically. The government has some set rules. If someone's income falls below the poverty line, for instance, he or she is eligible for government assistance. Now in a recession, more people fall below the poverty line. More people become eligible. And if they become eligible, by the government rules, they start to receive payments from the government, welfare payments from the government. You follow me? And this is an automatic increase then in government spending on these programs. Correct? The government had to do nothing deliberate. This happened automatically. So government spending went up, and isn't this exactly what is called for? Isn't this exactly what is called for in expansionary fiscal policy? But this happened automatically. Correct? Now next, let's look at the automatic effect on taxes. Right? Now, a large component, rather, the major component of the government's tax revenues are income taxes, right? And how are income taxes structured? Income tax is a percentage of people's incomes, right? Now, in a recession, what happens to people's incomes? With real GDP going down, everyone's income is going down. So if everyone's income is going down, the income tax, which is simply a percentage of income, is also going to start to go down. Correct? Let's say that the tax was 25% of income. With income going down, the 25% of something smaller is itself smaller. You follow? So the government's tax revenues go down, right? And isn't this exactly what is called for in this instance, correct? Lower taxes, and that's exactly what's happening here. Right? So this is what's meant by automatic fiscal policy. Let's contrast that with discretionary fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy is deliberate. This is deliberate fiscal policy. Now consider the recession we're currently in because of the economy shutting down on account of the health crisis. So we've heard that what the government is planning to do is greatly increase its spending, something to the tune of $2 trillion, to help out businesses, etc. Right? There'll be all these loans, even grants to businesses, so that businesses can continue paying their workers, etc. Right? This essentially required an act of Congress. Right? So this is what's meant by discretionary fiscal policy. This needs to be brought about by an act of Congress and the President. Right? So fiscal policy has these two components, automatic and discretionary. This also then implies that when you look at the government's budget deficit, right, and what is the budget deficit again? The budget deficit is simply G minus T. So when you consider G minus T and you look at the automatic aspect of fiscal policy, what do you think happens to this in a recession? In a recession, government spending on helping out the poor goes up because there are simply more poor people eligible for government assistance. And what happens to taxes? Well, I just mentioned that the prime source of taxes is income taxes. And with people's income shrinking in a recession, income taxes are going to go down. Correct? So what happens to G minus T then? G going up causes G minus T to go up. T going down also causes G minus T to go up. Right? So in a recession, we expect the budget deficit to go up. What about the opposite of a recession? What about when there is an economic expansion? A boom, in other words. So when there is an economic expansion, then G is going to go down and T is going to go up. There will be fewer poor people eligible for government assistance. The government spending on income security programs will go down, and people's incomes will rise, and therefore the government's income taxes will rise. Taxes being a percentage of people's incomes. Correct? So this would cause G going down and T going up. Well, both of these would cause the budget deficit to go down. So this essentially then exhibits cyclicality. It changes according to the business cycle. Right? To be specific, it is counter-cyclical. It is counter-cyclical, meaning it is opposite to the business cycle. When the economy is booming, when the business cycle goes up, right? Do you remember the business cycle looks something like this? If you have time on this axis and real GDP on that axis, The business cycle is these ups and downs, correct? So what I'm saying here is that the the cyclical part of the budget deficit is counter-cyclical, meaning when GDP is going up, that would go down. You follow me? So we can have a graph that's completely opposite of the business cycle, and that would be the graph for the budget deficit, or the cyclical part of the budget deficit. Right? Now, just as we have a cyclical part of the budget deficit, G minus T has a cyclical component, there is also a structural. There's also a structural component, and this is the part that would be observed even when the economy is booming. Right? So the structural part of the budget deficit remains even at full employment. Right? So we have, to recap quickly, we have the automatic aspect of fiscal policy and the discretionary aspect of fiscal policy. Related to the automatic part of fiscal policy is the cyclical part of the budget deficit. Right? Next, let's look at some difficulties with fiscal policy. Problems with discretionary fiscal policy. Right? Now that's the part that has to be done deliberately by Congress and the President. Correct? So when there is a recession, besides the automatic fiscal policy kicking in, by the way, there is another name for automatic fiscal policy. It's called automatic stabilizer. Right? So the automatic fiscal policy also goes by the name automatic stabilizer, because it automatically stabilizes the economy, meaning if there is a recession, an expansionary fiscal policy is called for, meaning a rise in G and a fall in taxes are called for. This partly happens automatically, as I just mentioned. There'll be more eligible poor people, and so government spending on providing them with income security automatically goes up. Taxes automatically go down because taxes are largely a fraction of people's incomes, and people's incomes shrink during recessions. Right? So this automatically works towards bringing the economy back to full employment, automatically. Right? But again, coming now to problems of discretionary fiscal policy. Right? So this is fiscal policy that is deliberate. Right? So besides the automatic stabilizer, the government may, as it is currently, may decide to increase government spending to bring the economy back to full employment. Right? In a very serious recession, there would be discretionary fiscal policy besides the automatic stabilizer. So what are the problems of discretionary fiscal policy? The first problem is called crowding out. And what crowding out is as follows. If G goes up, this may cause the sum of the other three spendings, C plus I plus X minus M. These three, the sum of them may go down. In other words, government spending may push out or crowd out the other three components of spending. So what is the effect of this on the aggregate demand curve? So once again, let's draw that diagram. This is Y star less than YF. So the purpose of fiscal policy was to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right like this by, let's say, increasing government spending as part of expansionary fiscal policy. But now, because of this, because of the other three spendings going down, the AD curve shifts back leftwards. So it went to the right like this because of the increase in government spending, but then it moved back leftwards a bit, so that in the end, the shift was much more modest than anticipated. So what crowding out has done is it has weakened expansionary fiscal policy. Instead of the AD curve shifting all the way from the solid red line to the dotted red line, it moves from the solid red to the solid blue. Right? So what has happened here is that fiscal policy has been weakened. Right? So this is one problem. Now you might ask, well, why does crowding out happen? Why does crowding out happen? And the commonest explanation is as follows. Let's say the government increases its spending without increasing taxes. Right? Remember, with expansionary fiscal policy, G would actually go up and T would have to go down and not up. Correct? So this, of course, means that the government runs a budget deficit. Correct? Now, what is the budget deficit going to do? It's going to mean the government must borrow. Now, I'm going to give you a little diagram of the credit market. So this is the diagram for the credit market, the market for loans. So here we have the quantity of loans. What's the price of a loan? The price of a loan is the interest rate, lowercase letter r. This is the market demand curve for loans, and this is the supply curve of loans. And we have equilibrium here where the two curves intersect, and that gives us the equilibrium rate of interest, R star. So with the government borrowing, what happens in this diagram is that the demand for credit curve shifts to the right. And that's because the government is stepping in as a big borrower. Right? So what does this do to the equilibrium interest rate? You can see here that the equilibrium interest rate will rise from R to R star to R double star. We have a rise in the interest rate. Right? So as a result of this, we're going to see a rise in the interest rate R. Now, what does the rise in the interest rate do to consumption spending and investment spending? Well, we know that households buy big ticket items like cars and refrigerators on credit. So with the price of credit going up, households will be less likely to borrow with which to go shopping. So we immediately have a fall in consumption spending financed by credit. And just as households borrow money to go shopping, businesses also borrow money to go shopping. Businesses often borrow money to buy machinery. With more expensive borrowing, with higher interest rate, investment spending will also fall. Correct? And this, of course, means that there will be a decrease in aggregate demand. Right? So this is the leftward shift that we see here. The leftward shift from the red dotted AD curve to the solid blue AD curve. Right? So this is how crowding out might occur, and this is a problem with discretionary fiscal policy. Crowding out reduces the effectiveness of fiscal policy. Right? The second problem with discretionary fiscal policy is time lags. And there are three time lags here that once again work to reduce the effectiveness of fiscal policy. And they are, first, the recognition lag. And what this is about is it takes the government time to figure out whether a recession has arrived. Right? So let's say there's a recession brewing. It may take the government a while to realize this. And this is called the recognition time lag. So by the time the government gets its act together, the government tries to get fiscal policy to work, the recession may already be deep. Correct? So this is a recognition lag. The second lag is called the legislative lag. So once the government recognizes that there is a recession, the government might then want to increase spending and or cut taxes. But this requires an act of Congress. And if the political parties are bitterly divided as they are today, it may take a very long time for the necessary spending and tax bills to be passed in Congress, to clear Congress. Right? So that is a second lag, and by this time, the recession may well have become a deep depression. Right? And our third time lag that reduces the effectiveness of fiscal policy is called the implementation lag. Once Congress decides that yes, government spending is going to go up and taxes are going to go down, the next lag happens when the government has to decide where to spend the money. The actual spending of the money takes time, and that is the implementation lag. Right? So these are again three time lags that reduce the effectiveness of fiscal policy. The third problem with fiscal policy is the fact that it might be viewed as temporary. Viewed as temporary by households, for instance. So let's say that the government cuts taxes as part of expansionary fiscal policy. The idea is that the government would take less taxes from us households, leaving us households with more of our income with which to go shopping. Right? But if we view this tax cut as temporary, we may decide to, instead of going shopping, to simply put the money in the bank because this is temporary. It's not going to last. Right? So if the taxes go down temporarily, this may not cause the necessary increase in consumption spending that the government was hoping for. Right? So if fiscal policy is viewed as temporary, this may not have as big an impact as when fiscal policy is viewed as a permanent change. The fourth problem is that fiscal policy really can't address structural change in the economy. Now, what is meant by the structural change of the economy, the changing structure of the economy? Well, this is when, because of changing patterns of international comparative advantage, the very structure of the economy changes. Some industries that were very important in the old days are now dying out, and new industries are being born. Right? The US used to have a comparative advantage in heavy manufacturing, but it's losing that comparative advantage to other countries. We used to be a big manufacturer of steel. Our steel factories are now pretty much ailing. Right? So with this changing structure of the economy, the fact that manufacturing is declining, a lot of manufacturing workers will be thrown out of work, and they will make up the so-called structurally unemployed. Right? The other component of natural unemployment. Remember, natural unemployment consists of frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. Right? Now, fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy, really can't deal with structural change. It can't really put those structurally unemployed workers back to work, because for those guys to become employable again, they have to learn new skills. Right? So simply, the government simply going out there and building new highways as part of an increase in government spending is not going to help these workers being laid off from the dying sectors of the economy, workers who don't have skills that are currently in demand. Right? And the last problem is the problem of political realities. Let me explain this. We know that when there is a recession, what's needed, what's called for, is an increase in government spending. Right? But this would be very difficult to convince a politician about. How's that? Because you're going to have to tell a politician that just when tax revenues are low, now remember, in a recession, the government's tax revenues fall, because as I mentioned, taxes are a share of people's incomes, and people's incomes are shrinking in a recession. So you're going to have to tell the government or the politician to increase spending at a time when tax revenues are shrinking. So it's like asking a guy to go and spend more money just when his paycheck is shrinking, right? Difficult for the government to digest, right? On the other hand, when there is inflation, right, when the AD curve is shifting to the right and the economy's equilibrium GDP is racing towards full employment GDP, right? Unemployment is not a worry, but demand pull inflation is. Now you want to tell the government to decrease spending. So you're going to have to tell the government to decrease spending at a time when the economy is booming, when the AD curve is shifting to the right, and government tax revenues are rising because people's incomes are rising. And this is when you tell them to reduce their spending so as to prevent demand pull inflation. So you're telling the government the opposite of what it typically wants to hear. You're telling them to increase their spending when their tax revenues are shrinking. You're telling them to increase their spending when their tax revenues are shrinking, and you're telling them to decrease their spending when their tax revenues are increasing. Right? So this is the problem of political realities. It's difficult to convince the government to do the right thing, macroeconomically speaking. All right. Next. How effective is fiscal policy? How effective is discretionary fiscal policy? Because of all the problems I've mentioned, principally the problem of crowding out and the problem of the time lags, both of which work to reduce the effectiveness of fiscal policy. The consensus among economists now is that fiscal policy is not always very effective. It should be used in times of emergency when there is a deep recession, as we're currently seeing with our health crisis. Correct? Now is the time for fiscal policy. But if there are some, smaller recessions, then fiscal policy is perhaps not the best kind of policy. So the phrase being used here is that fiscal policy is typically a blunt instrument. So it's not a precision instrument, it's a blunt instrument. So you want to use it only when there is a deep recession, when there is an emergency. For a minor recession, you want to just leave it to automatic fiscal policy, the automatic stabilizer, right? So for minor or lesser recessions, you leave it to the automatic stabilizer. So don't bring in deliberate fiscal policy, just leave it to the automatic aspect of fiscal policy. Plus use monetary policy. So let the Fed use monetary policy. This is something we will study later on in this course. And monetary policy is really about the Fed changing the rate of interest. Right? So again, how effective is discretionary fiscal policy? It is not a precise instrument, it's a blunt instrument. There are many factors that cause it to be less effective than it might be. So let's just use it in an emergency when the recession is a deep recession. But when the recession is a relatively minor one, let us leave it to the automatic stabilizer and to monetary policy. Right? Finally, last question is, should governments insist on balanced budgets? Now, many politicians insist or like the idea of the US government having a balanced budget. Our government has run a budget deficit for decades now. The last time the government has had a budget surplus. So when do we have a budget surplus? A budget surplus occurs when government spending is less than taxes. The government spends less than it collects in taxes. There is money left over, in other words. The last time we had a budget deficit was during the Bill Clinton years. You follow me? Since then, we've been running budget deficits. And remember, I mentioned that when the government runs a budget deficit, it has to borrow, increasing the national debt. What is the national debt again? It's the total sum the government currently owes. So every time the government uses its credit card, its total borrowing, the total amount that it owes, goes up. And that is the national debt. Right? So because some politicians worry about the huge size of our national debt is approximately the size of our GDP. Right? So our national debt is, by some reckoning, about $22 trillion, which is about the size of our GDP. Right? So some people are worried about this high national debt, and so they would like a law that forces the government to always keep these two things equal. Would that be a good thing? Some economists believe that that would be a good thing because that would prevent the government from borrowing and adding to our already very large national debt. But there are arguments against this. We don't want to be stuck on this. Why? Because sometimes, in a deep recession, the government has to increase its spending, as now. Right now, the government is trying to increase its spending to the tune of $2 trillion to help out people hurt by the economy standing still on account of our health crisis. Correct? So we don't want this to happen because this would tie the government's hands. It would prevent expansionary fiscal policy. Because what we might want is we might want to raise this and decrease this. Right? And that were to happen, then G may well be bigger than T. And we want this to be possible. Correct? So it's a bad idea to insist on balanced budgets. The government should have some flexibility here to increase spending and cut taxes when it is necessary to do so, when there is high unemployment in the economy and a wide recessionary gap. And that, students, is the end of my lecture.